There we are. Hello to you all. So, here we are in an age of polycrisis. We have AI hurtling towards us faster than we can adjust to it. We have the climate changing faster than the scientists have predicted. We have democracy crumbling before our eyes in real time in a resurgent global imperialism. Here's the question: how can we navigate our way through this turbulence? Well, as Steffi pointed out there, I believe that history is one of our great unacknowledged tools that is being ignored mostly by our politicians and policymakers, by the tech industry as well. It's a great unused resource. You know, you'd never drive a car without looking in the rearview mirror, but that is what I feel that we're doing. So we need to think about history not as a clairvoyant predicting what will happen, but more as a counselor. And I want to share with you some ideas for learning the lessons of history from my new book, History for Tomorrow. And as you just heard, I'm giving away their free copies, English and German, upstairs by the coffee bar after this talk, so come and see me then. And in writing this book, I've been very inspired by Goethe, of course, who in his West-East Divan, his poems written in 1819, he said this: "He who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living from hand to mouth." And I love that idea that history is full of nourishment. But normally, when we think about learning from history, we think about learning from everything that went wrong, the warnings of history captured in that famous aphorism that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Now, of course, we must learn from the bad stuff, from colonialism, from fascism. But what I've tried to do in this book is focus on learning from what's gone right, the positive stories. And when I've looked through history and I look at 10 big challenges facing humanity, from the climate crisis to risks from AI, threats to democracy, genetic engineering, other things like that, what we can learn from global history, what I've noticed is that social innovation has been at least as important as technological innovation in creating change. And so I want to share with you 3 ways in which there's a kind of hidden power to social innovation. By social innovation, I simply mean advances or innovation in human organization and practices and activities. And let me begin with the first of my ways that I think we can see a hidden power of innovation in history is innovation through boundaries, particularly resource scarcity. Now, I want you to imagine you're standing on the old wooden Nihonbashi Bridge in the ancient Japanese city of Edo, now known as Tokyo. There are people chatting away, there are laborers pushing cartloads of rice, there are people rushing across to the fish market on the other side of the bridge. Now, what made Edo, today's Tokyo, so extraordinary, and by the way, this is in the 1750s, so the era of the Tokugawa shoguns, and what made Edo so remarkable wasn't just that it was a huge city of over 1 million people, so far bigger than London or Paris or Munich, indeed, at the time, but it also operated what we would today call a circular economy, where almost everything was reused, repaired, repurposed, or recycled. Partly because at that time Japan wasn't trading much with the outside world, there were shortages of precious resources like wood and cotton. So for example, a tradition of patchwork developed known as tattered rags, boro, tattered rags, where fragments of old cotton cloth were sewn together into garments, which were then passed on down the generations. Just like this one I'm wearing, this boro jacket I'm wearing, which is over 100 years old. I'll just do it's beautiful, says Steffi, it must be. A kimono might be used until the cloth began to wear out, and then it would be used as pajamas. Then it would be cut up into nappies. Then it would be turned into cleaning cloths. Finally, the precious cotton would be burnt as fuel. There were thousands of circular businesses in Edo, Tokyo, in the 18th century. There were people collecting used candle wax to be remolded into candles. Down-and-out samurai would be repairing old umbrellas. People would even pay you for your human waste, which they'd use as agricultural fertilizer. And also at the time, because they'd chopped down a lot of their old-growth forests in the early Tokugawa period, they introduced strict rationing regulations to help regrowth of forests and the world's first large-scale plantation forestry scheme. So 18th century Edo was one of the world's first large-scale examples of what we could call an ecological civilization. Now, it was by no means a utopia. It was full of feudal relationships, patriarchal relationships, but 300 years on, I believe it offers hope that we can create economies today that get beyond the chronic short-termist addiction to waste and the use of fossil fuels and our ecological blindness, and we can create a deep culture of sustainability. I mean, if we were going to, say, introduce edonomics today, we would ban the sale of standard smartphones, which, as you know, use over half of the elements of the periodic table and are thrown away after less than 3 years. And instead, we'd introduce regenerative standards. So the only phones available for sale would have recycled materials and be modular by design, like the Dutch Fairphone, with easily replaceable screens and batteries. And it wouldn't be hard. It just takes a bit of sensible regulation. It doesn't require a military dictatorship like they had in Edo. It just requires smart and sensitive regulations. So that's a lesson from history. But here's another one. Innovation, not through boundaries, but through conversation. I believe that conversation with strangers is one of the most powerful tools we have for long-term resilience of our societies. It's that kind of contact which builds social trust, cooperation, and empathy, as Steffi talked about, which can help us traverse turbulent times, particularly at times of hyperpolarization, which has been exacerbated by all those algorithms, which mean we're only talking to people in our own silos with our own views. What's the history of the power of conversation? Well, if I could go back to any moment in history, I would go back to the Spanish city of Cordoba in the south of Spain in about the year 1000, which was part of the Islamic kingdom of Al-Andalus, which existed between about the 9th and 13th century. Now, this is a period in history you may know known as the convivencia, or the coexistence, the living together, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians managed to live together in relative harmony. There were everyday outbreaks of violence and tensions. It wasn't a utopia, but in general, it was a time of cultural tolerance. So as you can see there, Muslims and Christians might play music together. Jews and Muslims might have a game of chess. People mixed together in the public bathhouses and in the marketplaces. And what held that society together, the convivencia, was not simply the shared language of Arabic, but it was the conversations that were happening in the marketplaces and in the bathhouses and over the chessboards and things like that. And another great example of the power of conversation is in London. Something very similar was happening in the early 18th century, when you had one of the great social innovations of the last 500 years, the coffee house, the coffee shop. As you can see in the pictures there was something very unusual about the coffee shops of the time. And by the way, the coffee shops had come to Europe from Turkey in the 17th century. By 1700, there were about 2,000 in London alone. And if you walked in, what you could see is what you can see there on those images, which is they have these communal tables. You would sit down and talk to strangers about the big issues of the day. There were periodicals and pamphlets on those tables, so you might talk about republicanism or the abolition of slavery. These were really schools of democracy, schools of citizenship. As you may know, the great German political theorist Jürgen Habermas, he wrote about this in the early 1960s, 1962, actually, in his famous book on the structural transformation of the public sphere. He loved the coffee houses of London because this is where we learned to be democrats in a way. And I think we need to learn about them today. Many of you will know, of course, examples of really coffee house cultures online and offline, the conversations going on. One you will know, of course, is Deutschland spricht. Joachim Wegner, I think, was on the stage here last year, one of the founders of it. And as most of you know, one of the ways it works is that people would still fill out a basic online form with their political views, and people are matched up with their political opposite to overcome polarization, to have an online conversation, sometimes offline, mostly online, about many issues, general politics, immigration, climate, many things. Over 100,000 people have taken part, and as you may know, a recent study showed that on average, when pairs of people are put together, 90% of those pairs talk for more than 1 hour, and 30% of them speak with each other for more than 2 hours. So it doesn't get people to change their views radically, but it does get them to at least sit down and listen to the other person. And this is what I've tried to do in other projects I've been involved in myself, like the Oxford Muse, which was a charity invented to create conversations between strangers. I ran it for a few years. And what we did is we would invite people, hundreds of people, to come for a meal. People from different backgrounds, religions, ethnic backgrounds, class backgrounds, ages. And we'd sit them down, and instead of giving them a menu of food, We gave them menus of conversation, which you can see on the screen there, with questions about life on them, like, what have you learned about the different varieties of love in your life? Or in what ways would you like to be more courageous? And again, it was like the opposite of speed dating. You talk for 2 hours, not for 2 minutes. But I think these kinds of projects, which are based on history, and by the way, the Oxford Muse was based on the coffee house ideas of the 18th century. These projects raise the question of what are our own conversational habits? And what I'd like to invite you to do now is to all stand up for a moment, if you can, for me, please. Stay sitting if you need to stay seated. You stand up, and I want you now, when I give you the signal, but only when I give you the signal, I want you to spend just 2 minutes talking about the question on the screen here, which is, who do you need to be having conversations with to challenge your own perspectives and assumptions about others? So who do you need to be having conversations with? So on the count of 3, I want you to blow the roof off this beautiful room with your conversations. Turn to a stranger, someone behind you, next to you. 1, 2, 3, go. One minute left. 9 minutes. Off this beautiful room with your conversations. Turn to a stranger, someone behind you, next to you. 1. Okay, could you now please sit down again? Thank you very much. I like your disobedience, but this is a moment for obedience. Thank you very much. I'm going to run over time if you don't sit down. Okay. Let me now just introduce you to... I've never seen such disobedience, but luckily that's what I'm going to talk about. Disobedience and disruption. So the third point, the third big lesson from history is about the importance of innovation through disruption. I don't know about you, but I get incredibly frustrated with our governments, which when we have these big crises, whether it's a melting ice sheet or wildfires or financial crashes, we still tend not to take the action at speed and scale that we need. It happens sometimes, transformative change during wars or during pandemics, but how do you make it happen in other situations? And this is something I've really looked at in my new book. And what I've come up with is a recognition that if you want to have rapid transformative change in a society, 3 things need to happen together. I call this the disruption nexus. The first thing you need is some kind of crisis, technological, political, ecological, financial. The second thing you need is you need innovative ideas, ideas that can help change the old system, new models. And the third thing you need are disruptive movements to help amplify, extend the sense of crisis. You need these 3 things to come together as a rule of thumb. It's not an iron law of history. I mean, just think, for example, could think of many examples, but think of this, the collapse of state socialism in East Germany, 1989, lots of academic evidence around this, that clearly 3 things really happened together. Of course, there was the crisis, right, in the leadership of the East German government in the summer of 1989. You had the ideas, around freedom of movement, freedom of association, ideas coming out of Václav Havel, the power of the powerless, many other things like that. And of course, you had the great movements. You had the people on the streets in Leipzig and other cities, and of course in Berlin in early November 1989. And of course, it was a complex there are many other factors involved, but these are like three common denominators which keep coming up through history. If you don't have all three of them, you may not get the change. Think of the financial crash in 2008, where you had the crisis of the crash itself, you had the disruptive movements of the Occupy movement spread around the world, but I don't think we had the new economic models like donor economics or the well-being economy to replace the old system. We ended up bailing out the banks, and the system didn't really change. Now, I just want to say something. I think you can all ask yourself as well, where do you sit as a change maker in this disruption nexus? Where do you want to take action? Where do you feel you could, or where you do? But I wanted to say something more about the disruptive movement corner, because I think this really matters for the issues we're talking about here at DLD. I want you to imagine, send your mind back to the 1820s, when over 700,000 enslaved people were working on British-owned sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Now, at that time, many plantation owners and financiers made remarkably similar arguments to today's fossil fuel executives to defend their actions. They admitted that slavery was morally questionable, but they argued that if we ended it too quickly, we could have an economic collapse. So they argued that slavery should be phased out very gradually over many decades, which is precisely what today's fossil executives argue as well, with a fundamental gradualism. Now, at that time, there was an abolition movement in Britain, but it was quite reformist. It was lobbying politicians, sending out pamphlets. The turning point came in 1831 in an act of disruption which sent shockwaves across Britain and the British Empire, which was the Great Jamaica Slave Revolt, when over 20,000 enslaved workers rose up in rebellion. They set fire to more than 200 plantations. That revolt was brutally crushed, but it sent a wave of panic through the British establishment, who realized that if they didn't grant freedom to the slaves, they could lose the whole colony of Jamaica. That's why, in 1833, there was an Abolition of Slavery Act, which was not perfect by any means, but without the disruption, it would have taken decades longer for abolition to enter the statute books. Now, today, many people get a bit upset or even angry at some of the radical climate movements, the nonviolent ones, Extinction Rebellion, Ende Gelände, organizations like that, but we must remember that they are part of long historical traditions, going back to the Jamaica rebels, going back to those who fought for Indian independence or the civil rights movement in the United States or the suffragettes who fought for the votes for women. That these movements have helped amplify crises, catapulted agendas onto politics, into the political space. The tragedy is that while figures like Martin Luther King Jr. are celebrated in our school history textbooks, their modern equivalents in the ecological movements are demonized by the press and criminalized by the police. I sort of sometimes think we've learned nothing from history, and it's time that we did and recognize it's too risky and too late to leave these problems to simmer away on the low flame of gradualism. But let me now just bring together these three innovations to say something about AI. Because there's a question here, what can we learn from history about dealing with the risks of artificial intelligence? And I think you can ask yourself the historical question, which is what I do in one of the chapters of my new book, which is, have human societies ever created large-scale systems that resemble AIs in some ways that could potentially get out of control? And I think there is a really good historical parallel, which is the invention of financial capitalism in the Netherlands in the early 17th century. When we invented the first stock markets, this is the stock exchange in Amsterdam, we invented public limited companies, marine insurance. And the thing about this financial system, which looks all very nice and calm here in this picture, is that it very soon got out of control, right? So we had the great tulip crashes, we had the Mississippi bubble, the Wall Street crash, the 2008 crash. And I think, though, what it tells us, of course, is that AI has this same potential, but to get out of control, but it's going to happen much, much faster because of what Tristan Harris talked about on this stage last year, which is the race for recklessness, the way that companies have an incentive to release their models without taking safety precautions, which you've heard all about from Stuart Russell today. We do not know how to control these systems, yet the companies are releasing them because of fear. They're afraid they're going to lose market share, lose out to China, and so, or lose their investors. And I think that the three innovations I've talked about are all absolutely relevant to this. We need new conversations about both the opportunities and the risks of AI that are not dominated by the voices of venture capital and Silicon Valley tech oligarchs, but bring in the voices of the global south and the interests of future generations. We need regulation and not be afraid of regulation. We must remember that regulation Boundaries create innovation. That's what we learned in Edo, Japan. And we know that Mozart composed on a 5-octave piano. We know that Jimi Hendrix played on a 6-string guitar. Innovation can happen within boundaries, and we need those guardrails. And thirdly, we need the disruptive movements around AI, which are not here yet, but I think we need the equivalent of Fridays for Future and Ende Gelände and Extinction Rebellion, but for AI. So those movements on the streets can amplify the crisis to make us recognize that we need what Audrey Tang will talk about tomorrow, civic AI. We need to put the guardrails on, and we need to make sure that the benefits of our AI are distributed to all. So as we journey towards tomorrow, let's remember that, of course, history has always been used and abused by those in power. We should not approach it blindly. We must remember it can be romanticized, there can be nostalgia bias, things like that. But let us also draw on the wisdom of this great Maori proverb from Aotearoa, New Zealand: I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on the past. And I love this quote so much, I want us all to say it out loud after me in Maori. Okay, so I'm going to go first, going to split it in 2 parts, me first, then you. So, kia whakatomori, tahaere whakamua. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you all so much.